My name's Lawrence McNamara. I work at the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law. We're a research organisation. We work in rule of law research and policy. I've been there for 3 years. I'm Deputy Director and a Senior Research Fellow. Prior to that, I was a university academic in Australia and the UK for around 17 years.
And what area of research does your work like?
I work particularly in areas relating to national security, counter-terrorism, focusing especially on issues surrounding transparency and accountability. I work more widely in issues relating to media freedom and media regulation, but particularly in impact terms, I've had a particular focus on national security issues. I've engaged with policy processes in a range of ways, most particularly though in responding to consultations, and responding to consultations is a really valuable way that you can have input into policy, law, legislative change, law and policy processes. The most substantial engagement I had was in the lead up to what eventually became the Justice and Security Act in 2013. And in the around 18 months, I think, the processes through a green paper, through a bill, through to various stages of amendments, through to enactment, I had quite a lot of engagement with how that legislation would look, the rationale behind its operation, various bits of analysis on what some of the transparency and accountability provisions might be, what were, based on my research, the appropriate scope and limits of that type of legislation.
What were some of the difficulties that you encountered?
It was, for me, in a lot of ways, quite a learning process. Partly purely the engagement with parliamentary processes, partly as an academic, having not that long been in the UK at that point, engaging with a different processes in a different country. I come from Australia originally. The points at which I was engaging were the government published a green paper, which is, in short, a position paper that says, well, we propose to introduce legislation that will do the following things, and these are the reasons why, and we are seeking comments on this. I made a consultation response to that. I had also, then it goes into the parliamentary process where there is a bill. There are parliamentary committees looking at it, and again they have a public call for evidence, so I made a response to that. As a result of the written evidence, I was invited to give oral evidence to the Joint Committee on Human Rights. Along the way, I also then was engaging more publicly, whether it was through the wider public, writing a couple of op-ed pieces for major media outlets, doing a little bit of comment to news and current affairs, writing and engaging with the key stakeholders through whether it was some of the major blogs in the area, so then that parliamentary and legal audience that had particular sort of influence in the legislation, that wider community that was helping shape the legislation. So in that engagement you have different types of audiences you're trying to reach. And so I set about putting my position across and what I thought the legislation should look like. And some of those recommendations I made were then taken up and tabled as amendments. Some of those amendments did not succeed, a couple did. And so it was both an interesting and, to my mind, a really valuable part of one of a huge number of people having input from all sides of the political and legal spectrum. But it was an opportunity to play a part in that and to inform the legislation based on evidence and research, evidence-based research.
Was it clear to you at which point you had actually achieved what we call impact from your research on policy?
In my case it was. So I think the sense of what impact is often defined in different ways, and it can be the sort of gold standard is often described in whether it's the Research Council's processes or other funders as being that, well, you did some research and you discovered something, and then as a result of that something changed, some economic, social, political, cultural influence, that something is different than it was before. In my case, there was a very clear. I was very fortunate, I was very lucky, I think, that the recommendations I had made were taken forward in tabled amendments, and there was an explicit acknowledgement of that in the parliamentary processes, that the source of some of these amendments were the submissions I had made. That's incredibly lucky, and it's very, very difficult to find yourself in a position where you have secured a very clear outcome on that front. In other ways, though, there are degrees of impact in terms of shaping the debate. So even where something might not actually make its way through to change the legislation, or it might be, it can still be impact because it shapes the complexion of the debate. But it's very hard often to identify the evidence chain for that impact. And some funders will really want that. They're looking for the kind of case studies that can demonstrate that. So in my case, I think I was very fortunate on that front.
Could you say something perhaps about why you think it's important for academics, and especially legal academics, to engage in these policy processes?
I think it's really important for legal academics, but not in any way that it is different for any other academic researchers, because academics bring to the policy field a body of research, a body of evidence, a body of knowledge, contributions to knowledge. And I think that what makes it so important is that public policy is informed by evidence, that it's evidence-based policy. And so there is, I think, a responsibility on the part of academics to bring that knowledge to bear into the policy process. And there are different ways to do it, there are different degrees of specific engagement, but to bring it to the attention either of the policy community or of others who might be working more directly in that process. So I think it's really important that you get better law, you get better policy.
Given some of the challenges that we've discussed and the difficulties of showing the impact that you might have had, have you got any tips or recommendations to PhDs and especially early career researchers for how they might achieve impact or engage with policy as part of their work?
There's any number of bits of advice out there and bits of suggestions that are made to PhD students, to early career researchers, and increasingly so even with a resource like this you're putting together. There is all sorts of advice out there. Some of the things I would say are, if you're looking to work out how you engage with policy communities, ask people. Ask those who've done it before, and whether it's consulting resources, whether it's books or impact kits that are put out by some of the funders of the research councils. But I think it's really important to have conversations with people, because you need to get a sense of the difficulties, and in publicly stated things tend not to be quite as frank as things that are stated a little more off the record, where you will get some of the difficulties and the hurdles people have to overcome. One of the big things that academics need to keep an eye out for, and legal academics are very fortunate here, is the opportunities to respond to consultations. So government and parliaments will often have consultation processes, they have calls for evidence. You need to keep an eye on those things. On the Parliament homepage here, there is a list of committees that have current open calls for evidence, and you should definitely make responses to those when it's on point in particular. The next thing I would say is that in a response, you need to be really clear. They will have guidelines about what your written evidence or consultation response should say. Follow those guidelines. The big challenge a lot of academics have is you work with very complex ideas, often with vast amounts of data, and the end users of research often need things to be very, very short. And you will repeatedly hear it said that it needs to be on one page with a series of bullet points, and that is so important. It might be that there's a 3,000 word limit on evidence, and they will ask for a one-page summary. You need to have one page with a series of bullet points that is clear and concise. You need to keep in mind, for instance, there's a current consultation where there's 120 pieces of evidence submitted. to a current consultation on a major bill, and somebody has to read through all those, so they will value that. I think the next thing that's important about making a response in a policy context is you need to put forward some recommendations, very concrete, clear recommendations. Academics work with the strengths and weaknesses and the nuances of arguments, and that's really, really important. Things are very complex, but it doesn't mean that you can't put forward some specific recommendations, because that's what that community is often looking for. This can be a little daunting at times because there is an inherent tendency, I think, to say, and kind of rightly so, that things are very complex. It's not so simple as putting a recommendation forward. And occasionally a feeling of, but then that's quite a lot of responsibility to say, well, I think this is what the law should look like, or I think this is how aid should be distributed, or I think this is how the rights framework should exist. I think you need to remember as a researcher that you don't decide. It's not your decision. You're informing the policy community. Other people are deciding, and this is it's a collective process that is involved in all sorts of ways. I think the next thing I would say is, in dealing with policy, make it clear that you have an evidence base, that you are relying on your research. This is highly valued by policymakers, by legislators, that you have evidence that supports your position. And they want to know what the evidence is, and they need to know what the evidence is. It can be useful in making a response not just to do so as a single individual academic, but to do so, if you can do so as part of, whether it's a group of academics or under the auspices of a research centre within your university, or whether it's the law school or so forth. Make clear your affiliation, and the weight of that affiliation counts for a lot. Academic expertise is highly valued because it is independent, and that's really important. The final thing I would say, especially to PhD candidates and early career researchers, is while there is a huge emphasis, or an increasing emphasis on impact as an activity you should be undertaking, impact-oriented activity, you should never lose sight of the fact that you need to balance out what you do with other commitments. In particular, PhD students finish that PhD. That is, especially if you're looking at an academic career, but even if not, you need to get that PhD finished, and you can't let that balance. The impact-oriented work can take up huge amounts of time. The second thing is that is publication. A sole author publication in a peer-reviewed journal will count for a huge amount, and rightly so, in job applications, in interviews, in the Research Excellence Framework, the REF. It's an essential, and it can be easy to be distracted. So I think you need to balance what you're doing in the course of all that.